Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here with a follow-up to the parable of the golden eggs. Now, to briefly reiterate, the parable involves a little scenario, a scene where you place yourself in a park. A stranger approaches you and holds out his hand and drops a golden egg into your palm. That is the first golden egg that you receive, the gift of common sense. And you don't have to know who's giving it to you. In the second part of the little scene, once again a stranger approaches you, holds out his hand to drop the egg in the palm of your hand, and even though he opens his hand, you do not receive the egg. The parable teaches that you cannot receive the second egg without knowing who gives it to you. And that is the sum and essence of the little parable. Of course, the extrapolation of that parable can go quite far. So in this talk, I'm going to take you through some of the considerations that arise regarding the second golden egg. First of all, I can point out something that I consider to be really essential. If you want to know about the human psyche, human identity, and if you investigate the ways in which human animals through the ages have envisioned or imagined God, well, in my opinion, based on the research I've done, you come up with a remarkable observation. Namely, everyone, including you and myself, have received their concept of God from someone else. No one on the earth, no living human animal, now or ever, has a concept of God that has not been received from someone else. That statement begs the question, well, where does the concept of God, in whatever framework or culture or racial setting it may appear, arise? How does the concept of God arise in the first place? Well, the question is important in its precise phrasing. Note that I'm asking about the concept of God. Now, it could be argued that there were cases in the past when certain individuals encountered spontaneously, mystically, however you want to put it, encountered a presence. The encounter with a divine presence has happened to certain individuals in the past. No doubt about it. There are various records or accounts of such direct encounters with God coming from different cultures. One that comes to mind, of course, would be the Vedic or Hindu culture of ancient India. So it could be said, for the sake of argument, yes, there were certain cases in which individuals encountered God. Probably the best known in the world is the case of Moses, described in the Old Testament. So Moses went up to Mount Sinai and encountered the presence of God, of some divine or supernatural power. And likewise, earlier in the book of Genesis, it is said in that fairy tale that Abraham also encountered the presence of God at the moment when he was about to sacrifice his son Isaac to prove his obedience to that very God. So let's allow, for the sake of argument, that there have been genuine encounters with something that came to be called God, an entity, a presence of power of some kind, that came to be called by different names. So it's fair to say there were original instances of encountering the divine presence or the divine power. I'm not going to discuss those instances here. Rather, I want to make the point that those instances led to a situation where the witnesses to the divine presence turned around, described their experience to the world, and from that moment on, others who did not have the original and direct experience took their concept of God from someone who presumably had the direct experience of the presence of God. See that distinction? Now again, you, whoever you are out there, might consider that you have had the experience, or that you, to this day, in your life, can attest that you know and feel the direct presence of God, and then you go on to define God in your own terms. But as a matter of fact, you live in a world where you cannot possibly escape having been given a concept of God. So this distinction between a concept of God and the direct encounter with the divine is important and instructive for working out the ramifications of this parable. However, to be exact, the teaching contained in the parable does not concern your sense of God or whatever concept of God you may have received from parents, from your culture, your community. It doesn't concern that. It concerns something similar to that, which is your concept of your divine parents. Now, it might seem that I'm just talking about the same matter, the same topic in a different way. After all, in most cases, in the vast, huge majority of cases, the concept of God entertained by people around the world assumes that God, the divine being, the supreme being, is the creator of the human race, the creator of humanity in its totality, all the human races. And as you belong to one of those human races, when you imagine what your origin might have been, you go back to the origin of humanity, and there is God in some concept, and so God is the divine parent. But that is not exactly the case. Why not? Well, the body of evidence of world mythology, the mythology of all races that I've discussed in the course Mythology 101, contains an intermediary figure. There is God, the supreme being, who creates the entire universe and everything in it, if you want to think of it that way. But then there are intermediate between that entity and humans living on the earth today. There are a pair of parents. And how are these parents depicted? This is a really good question. If you were to go with that question, and I have always advised that if you explore mythology, you bring a good question to the subject, because the right question will produce better results of the investigation. So if you go with that question, it becomes a really interesting study. You can look at different mythological narratives, Polynesian, Aztec, Slavic, Greek, Roman, Chinese, and you can ask the question, how are the divine parents depicted in that narrative? You see, it's different than inquiring about God as such, as the supreme and ultimate creator. Now, this is how I would proceed in that investigation. In Mythology 101, which is a series of 13 talks, I invited you into my studio. So there you are in the studio of the comparative mythologist. And I brought you up to a large table, and there were 42 files on the table. And in those files were collections of texts, sacred writings, myths, legends, relating to the content of mythology from all races. So there was a file of Sumerian mythology, Egyptian, Chinese, Scandinavian, and so forth. 42 files in all. Now suppose we set all those files aside. They contain text. And I present you with another set of 40 or 50 files. And these are folders laid out on the table. And they are also labeled according to the races that originated them. But in these files, there are images, there are pictures, and not text. Now this becomes suddenly quite interesting, because once again, the question you bring to the subject matter determines the answer you get from it. For instance, I can pull 2 files down to the front of the table: Japanese myth and Persian myth. And before I open the files, I can ask the question, how are the divine parents of humanity pictured in these 2 cultures, these 2 racial groups? So I open the Japanese file, I open the Persian file, and I look through various images which can be found in the ancient art of those cultures, and perhaps also in some modern representations. And so what do you find if you do that with 50 different files? Well, I can assure you that there are some files in which the material is very spare. There are some cultures, like Slavic mythology or Polynesian mythology, which actually do not present images of that kind. And there are other mythologies, a few, which do present vivid graphic images of the parents, the divine parents of humanity, as they were imagined in those cultures. Now, of course, there is one particular image of divine parents that comes immediately to mind, isn't there? Due to the fact that the Abrahamic religion, the 3 Abrahamic religions, but particularly Judaism and Christianity, have been propagated around the world for centuries, it's quite common for people to know about Adam and Eve. And if you ask anyone on the street who Adam and Eve are, they're likely to say, well, they were the first people. They were the parents of all the human races. Now, I have to warn you here that that is most certainly not the case regarding the view of the authors of the biblical myth. I explained in Mythology 101, in a close scrutiny of the Hebrew file, written in the Semitic language as distinguished from Sumerian languages, I took some pains to point out that the creation story in Genesis contains an essential deceit. Adam and Eve meant one thing to those who authored that narrative, and it has been taken to mean something else by the world at large. It has been intentionally misrepresented. So to those who authored the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve do not represent the first people who lived on earth or the primal parents of the human races. And you would have to go and look at Mythology 101 to know what I'm talking about here. Nevertheless, it's quite conceivable that someone would have a photograph or an artistic representation of Adam and Eve standing in front of the tree in the Garden of Eden, and they might well regard those mythical characters as being our divine parents, the divine parents of humanity as a whole. But let's say that you don't accept that. Let's say that you're in the know or in the gnosis, and you've been informed by a certain comparative mythologist of the deceptive character of the creation story in the book of Genesis. And let's say also that you don't belong to the racial group that produced that narrative, and you might like to have a picture on the wall or even maybe a shrine in your house that shows you the divine parents of your own choosing. Well, how about that question? What images would you choose? And where would you find those images? Now, I'm going to take a slightly different angle here, but I'm going to remain on the same topic. Everyone has been in the home of someone else where you see photographs of the parents of that family, and you may well have the same. You may well have, for instance, a photograph of your father and mother on the desk or on the mantelpiece in your house. You may have a photograph of them the day they were married, or a photograph of them later on in their life when they were retired in some lovely scene where they're happy together, embracing each other and smiling. It's very, very common for people to have photographs like that in their houses, and some houses I've been into are actually chock full of family and parental photographs. But what about those homes where you find photographs of grandparents, of great-grandparents, of great-great-great-grandparents? Well, there are fewer and fewer of those photographs, obviously. Why? Various reasons. You may not know who your great-great-great-grandparents were. There is a point where your known parental ancestors fades out and your ancestors become anonymous. Rather like the anonymous stranger in the parable of the golden eggs. But hold on a minute. There's another way to look at your parental lineage, your genealogical lineage. You can consider, for instance, if you're Italian, that you have, and this is a true consideration, that you have ancestors who belong to the Italian race, who lived centuries before you. And even though you may not be able to identify a direct and accurate line of genealogical descent coming forward to you from those ancestors, they are nevertheless your ancestors. So, for instance, there are certain characters in the history of Italy and of the Italian peoples characters in the Renaissance, characters going back to the Middle Ages, going back to the time of the Romans. And they are the ancestors of Italians living today, even though, as I say, there is not a direct genealogical line that you can track. So, if you are so minded and you are Italian, you might want to have in your house, along with photographs of your known parents, you might want to have photographs of your racial ancestors, particularly of heroes and heroines in the past that you admire. They set an example for you. For instance, Marcus Aurelius was a famous Roman emperor. And even though you as an Italian may not be directly descended from him, you might admire him. So you might want to have a photograph of him on your wall. Other examples could be given. There are famous women in history as well. Cleopatra was an Egyptian. Perhaps if you are an Egyptian living today and you admire Cleopatra, you would have some kind of photo or representation of her on the wall in your house. So you see, there are levels or layers as you go into the depths of what might be called ancestral origins. And if you go all the way down that road, where do you arrive? Finally, you arrive at the divine parents of the totality of the human races. But how do you picture them? Where could you acquire any sacred art that would provide you with a visualization of those divine parents? I'm talking here about what might be called mythological optics. What are the optics for your divine parents, and mine as well? Well, believe me, I've looked into that question quite closely, and especially since I brought out the parable of the golden eggs. Now, I do have quite an extensive collection of files of images of parental gods from many cultures. And I've considered this question. If I were to propose to the world that they picture their divine parents in a certain way, in what file would I find the best option? Now, it might be said that it would be, let's say, inconsistent or inappropriate for anyone to select an image of divine parents that doesn't come out of the specific racial origin and racial ancestry of that individual. For instance, you might say, if you're Irish, I'm half Irish, and if you come from a Celtic Irish culture, your ancestry going back to the anonymous ancestors, the heroes and heroines of the past, if all of that is based in the racial origins of the Irish or Celtic people, then you should choose the image of your divine parents from that repertoire, from that inventory. That is very problematical, because if you go and look into these files closely, you'll find that many of them do not present the optics. For instance, Celtic mythology does not present the optics for divine parents. It simply doesn't. If you read the texts, the written myths and legends, you can infer that the Celts gave the name of Dagda to the supreme father of their race. And they gave the name Danu, relating to the river Danube, to the supreme mother of their race. But how do you picture Dagda and Danu? Do you find images of those two presumed ancestral parents in what remains of Celtic myth and art and literature. It's a difficult search, and you can search along the same line in the other 50 files, and very often you won't come up with anything satisfactory. So it happens, I can assure you as a comparative mythologist, that there are only a few files that contain, let's say, vivid and definite optics for picturing divine parents. The choices are quite limited. So as you know, mythology is the mythology of all races. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't come from some vague or abstract humanity. Every mythic narrative is race-specific in its origin. Remember the syllogism. Mythology is racist. John is a mythologist. Therefore, John is racist. So speaking as a racist, I would really like to offer to different people, you to whom I'm speaking, whatever your race may be, whatever your ethnicity may be, Spanish, German, Italian, French, Finnish, Russian, I would like to be able to present to you from my research those images of your divine parents which are consistent with your racial lineage. But I can't, because very few such examples survive. Well, why is this even a question for me? It's a question because it goes directly back to the takeaway of the parable of the golden eggs. What is the condition, exact condition, for receiving the second golden egg, which I have called the gift of divine sense? The parable teaches that in order to receive that golden egg, you must know who are the divine parents who give it to you. It is the divine parents who offer the second golden egg. So unless you have a concept of who they are, which, as I've said in the beginning of this talk, stands distinct from your concept of God, the Creator, the Supreme Being, whatever that may be, unless you have a concept and, more specifically, a visualization of those divine parents who give you the second golden egg, then you can't receive it. You see the problem here? Does it interest you? Does it intrigue you in any way? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you don't care. Maybe you don't need the mythological optics that enable you to picture your divine parents in a particular way, to actually visualize them. If you were able to visualize them, then you could include in your home not only a photograph of your parents, whether they be living or dead, but photographs of your grandparents and great-grandparents, and then you might also include photographs of some admirable individuals, heroes or heroines in the past history of your race. And additional to all that, going back to the most remote time imaginable, you might have two images side by side of the father and mother, the divine parents of the entire human species. But how would you know who those parents are? To what source would you go to find them? As I noted in Mythology 101, and I consider this to be perhaps the essential takeaway of that series of talks. As I noted, when you look into any particular racial cultural myth, Sumerian, Slavic, Aztec, Chinese, Greek, you find that the origin story specific to that race only describes the origin of the people of that race. It does not describe the origin of humanity as a whole. And I pointed out that there are only two mythic narratives in the totality that describe the origin of the human species generically. One of them is the biblical narrative at the foundation of the Abrahamic religions. And if you want to go there and see your parents, your divine ancestors in Adam and Eve, you're welcome to go there. But there is a competing narrative, and that is the Sophonic myth that describes the origin of the human genome in the galactic core. And it names the two divine beings who designed that genome, the material human genome, Sophia and Thelete. I can assure you that there is no other myth on the face of this earth that presents a clear and explicit identification of the divine parents of humanity. That is the only one. So, how then would you depict Sophia and Thelete? Well, they can't really be depicted on the basis of any precedents from ancient times. There are many representations of Sophia, or the goddess Sophia, particularly, for instance, in Greek Orthodox religion. But they are not representations that fit the optics of the living gnosis today. Some of them get by. For instance, there are New Age style representations of the earth as a woman, trees for hair, mountains for breasts. You've seen those. So you might picture the female divine parent in that way, but there is no representation whatsoever of the male divine parent coming out of the Gnostic sources. So this is problematic. If those are actually the two divine parents you would choose, and you might even choose to have a little shrine for them in your house, showing images of them side by side. But if you were to choose to do that, it would be difficult to know how to picture them. Nevertheless, and here we return to the instruction of the parable, unless you can identify them by name, well, you have the names, and simultaneously picture them, you cannot receive the second golden egg that comes from them. Now, I guess I would have to say, if I guess at how this talk is coming across, that it might strike you as a very odd proposition. And it is an odd proposition. It is. It's also a novel proposition. Has anyone ever come to you before and proposed this to you in the way that I'm doing? I don't think so. And so I want to leave you to reflect on that before I go to the fourth and final talk about the golden eggs. And that talk concerns the question, how do those who practice the living gnosis today worship their divine parents? Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.